I thought it was just another argument, until the words about his manhood left my mouth. The moment I saw the look on his face, I knew I'd crossed a line I could never take back. It was raining that night. Not the loud, dramatic kind of rain you see in movies, just a steady, quiet drizzle that tapped softly against the kitchen window like someone gently asking to be let in. The apartment felt warm, almost too warm, the kind of warmth that makes the air feel heavy when emotions start rising. Lena stood on the other side of the kitchen counter, her arms loosely folded as she leaned back against the marble surface. At 42, she carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need attention to be noticed. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose clip, a few strands escaping and framing her face. Normally, those little details softened her expression. Tonight, they only made the tension in her eyes more visible. I was 25, and in that moment I felt even younger. It had started as something small, one of those tiny disagreements that couples brush off without thinking. I honestly can't even remember exactly what the original topic was anymore. Something about a conversation we had earlier that week, maybe a misunderstanding, maybe a joke that landed wrong. But like many arguments, it slowly shifted from the original point to something deeper. Lena had this calm way of arguing. She didn't shout or slam doors. Instead, she asked questions, quiet ones that made you look at yourself more than the situation. Usually I admired that about her. That night, it made me defensive. "You're twisting what I meant," I said, pacing a little near the table. Her gaze followed me, steady but not hostile. "I'm not twisting anything," she replied gently. "I'm just trying to understand why you reacted that way." That calm tone somehow made the frustration build faster. I ran a hand through my hair and laughed under my breath, though there was no humor in it. "You're making it sound like I'm the problem," I said. Lena shifted slightly, uncrossing her arms. For a moment, she rested both hands on the counter, her fingers lightly gripping the edge as if grounding herself. "I'm not saying that," she said softly. "I'm saying something about this clearly bothered you." Her words hung in the air between us. The rain outside continued its quiet rhythm against the glass. And that's when it happened. Frustration twisted my thoughts, turning them sharp and careless. Without thinking, without even fully realizing what I was about to say, I threw out a sarcastic remark about another man we'd been discussing earlier. A cheap, immature comment about his manhood, meant to dismiss him, to win the argument in the laziest way possible. The moment the words left my mouth, the kitchen went completely still. Lena didn't shout. She didn't argue back. She simply stopped moving. Her eyes widened just slightly, the way someone reacts when they hear something unexpected, not shocking exactly, but deeply disappointing. The kind of disappointment that feels heavier than anger. For a long second, neither of us spoke. The rain kept falling outside. The refrigerator hummed quietly in the corner. Somewhere down the street, a car passed with tires hissing over wet pavement. And suddenly I felt it. That sinking, hollow feeling in my chest that comes when you realize you've crossed a line you didn't even see until it was too late. Lena slowly exhaled and looked away toward the window. When she turned back, her expression had changed, not furious, not dramatic. Just distant. And somehow, that silence hurt far more than if she had yelled. The next morning felt strange in a way I couldn't quite explain. Nothing dramatic had happened after the argument the night before. Lena hadn't slammed a door or raised her voice. She had simply gone quiet, said she was tired, and headed to bed. But somehow that quiet stayed with me. When I woke up, the memory of my words returned instantly, the careless comment, the way the kitchen had fallen silent afterward, the look in her eyes. I told myself I was overthinking it. People say things during arguments all the time. That's what arguments are, messy, emotional, imperfect. Still, the uneasy feeling refused to leave. Later that afternoon, we met at the small cafe where we usually grabbed coffee together after work. It was a cozy place on the corner of a busy street, the kind of cafe where the smell of roasted beans and fresh pastries filled the air the moment you walked inside. Normally, when Lena and I met there, the conversation started immediately. We'd tease each other about something small, share a story from our day, or laugh about something random we had seen on the way over. But that afternoon was different. When I walked in, she was already sitting at her usual table near the window. She looked up and gave me a polite smile. Not cold. Just careful. I sat down across from her, setting my phone and keys on the table. Hey, I said. Hey, she replied. Her voice was calm, but softer than usual. A barista placed 2 cups of coffee on the table, and Lena wrapped both hands around hers almost immediately, as if the warmth of the mug gave her something steady to hold on to. I tried to start a conversation. So, busy day. She nodded slightly. Pretty normal. Then she took a small sip of her coffee and looked out the window for a moment. The silence that followed stretched longer than it normally would have between us. It wasn't hostile. But it wasn't comfortable either. Usually, Lena had this warm way of connecting with people, holding eye contact, leaning forward when she listened, resting her hand casually near yours on the table. Now she seemed more reserved. Not distant exactly. Just guarded. At one point, as we both reached for the sugar jar in the middle of the table, our hands brushed lightly. Normally she might have laughed or made some small comment. Instead, she quietly pulled her hand back and let me take it first. It was a tiny moment. But I noticed. And suddenly the weight of what I had said the night before felt heavier than it had in the moment. We talked about a few ordinary things, work, a movie she had watched recently, a project I was finishing. But the conversation stayed on the surface. Careful. Measured. After about 20 minutes, Lena checked the time on her phone. I should probably head out soon, she said gently. So soon? I asked before I could stop myself. She gave a small apologetic smile. Long day tomorrow. I nodded, though something inside me told me that wasn't the whole reason. As we stood up from the table, the late afternoon sunlight streamed through the cafe window, casting warm light across the floor. For a brief second, we stood facing each other near the door. Normally we might have hugged goodbye. That had always been natural between us. But this time Lena simply gave a small wave and stepped outside. I watched her walk down the sidewalk for a moment before turning away. And that's when it really hit me. The distance between us wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet. And somehow, that made it feel even bigger. 3 days passed before Lena finally said she wanted to talk. Not a text filled with explanations. Not a long message trying to resolve everything. Just a short sentence that appeared on my phone late in the afternoon. Can we take a walk tonight? Those 6 words made my stomach tighten. We met just before sunset at a small park a few blocks from her apartment. It was one of those early evening moments when the day is slowly letting go but the night hasn't fully arrived yet. The sky glowed with soft orange and pale pink light, and the air carried that quiet calm that comes after a warm day. Lena was already there when I arrived. She stood near the walking path with her hands tucked into the pockets of a light jacket. Her dark hair moved gently in the breeze, and when she turned to look at me, I noticed something in her expression that I hadn't seen before. Not anger. Something heavier than that. We started walking side by side along the path without saying much at first. The gravel crunched softly under our shoes. Somewhere nearby, children were laughing at the playground, their voices distant but cheerful. Normally, Lena and I would have filled that silence easily. We were good at that, talking about small things, sharing little observations about the world around us. But tonight the quiet felt different. Finally, she spoke. Do you remember exactly what you said the other night? Her voice wasn't sharp. If anything, it was careful. I nodded slowly, feeling the familiar wave of embarrassment rise again. Yeah, I admitted quietly. I remember. She kept walking for a few steps before responding. It surprised me, she said. I waited for her to continue. Lena stopped near a small bench under a tall tree, the fading sunlight filtering through the leaves above us. She turned toward me, leaning one shoulder lightly against the wooden railing beside the path. You know, she began slowly, people think those kinds of comments are just jokes. Or insults you throw out during an argument. Her eyes searched my face, not accusing, just thoughtful. But they're not harmless. I swallowed, unsure how to respond. Lena looked down at the ground for a moment, gently brushing a loose strand of hair away from her face before speaking again. I was with someone once, she said quietly. Years ago. Someone who struggled a lot with his confidence. Her voice softened in a way that made it clear this wasn't an easy memory. He was kind, patient, but he always felt like he wasn't enough. Especially as a man. And people around him didn't help. She gave a faint, sad smile. Friends would make jokes. Little comments here and there. They thought it was harmless. She looked back at me then. But those things stay with people. The weight of her words settled heavily in the space between us. I didn't mean it like that, I said quickly. I wasn't thinking. I know, she replied gently. And that was the surprising part. She wasn't accusing me. She simply wanted me to understand. After a moment, she stepped a little closer and rested her hand lightly on my arm. The touch was warm, familiar, and somehow reassuring despite the difficult conversation. I'm not upset because you said it during an argument, she explained softly. Her fingers gave a small, thoughtful squeeze before she let her hand rest there. I was upset because it reminded me how easy it is for people to hurt each other without realizing it. Her eyes met mine again. And in that moment, I understood something important. The argument hadn't been about winning or losing. It had been about respect, and the quiet vulnerabilities people carry that you don't always see. We ended up sitting on the small wooden bench beneath the tall tree. The park had grown quieter now. The distant laughter from the playground had faded, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves moving in the evening breeze. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees while staring at the gravel path below my shoes. The fading light of sunset stretched long shadows across the ground, and the sky above us was slowly turning from warm orange to deep blue. My mind kept replaying the same moment from that night in the kitchen. The words. The silence afterward. The look on Lena's face. I let out a slow breath. I'd been thinking about it a lot, I finally said. Lena sat beside me, her posture relaxed but attentive. She turned slightly toward me, one leg tucked under the other as she listened. I wish I could say I didn't mean it, I continued, my voice quieter now. But the truth is, I said it because I was frustrated. The admission hung in the air. I felt like I was losing the argument, I added with a small, embarrassed smile. So I reached for the easiest thing I could say to shut it down. Lena didn't interrupt. She simply watched me with that same calm focus she always had when something mattered. I didn't even stop to think about how it sounded, I said. Or what it actually meant. For a moment, I hesitated, trying to put the rest into words. You've always been really thoughtful about how people feel, I said, glancing at her. And I guess, part of me felt exposed during that argument. Like you were seeing things about me I didn't want to admit. I ran a hand through my hair, shaking my head slightly. So instead of being honest, I said something careless. The breeze shifted gently through the trees above us, carrying the faint scent of grass and cool evening air. I'm really sorry, Lena. This time the words didn't rush out in defense or frustration. They came slowly, deliberately. I'm sorry for what I said, and for the kind of person I sounded like when I said it. For several seconds, Lena didn't respond. She simply studied my face, as if weighing the sincerity behind the apology. Then her expression softened. You know, she said quietly, most people try to explain their way out of mistakes. Her voice carried no bitterness, just quiet observation. You didn't do that. I shrugged slightly. I don't think there's a way to explain that one away. A small smile appeared at the corner of her lips. Finally, she reached out and placed her hand over mine. The touch was warm and steady, her fingers resting gently against the back of my hand. It wasn't dramatic or rushed, just a simple, grounding gesture. "I'm not expecting perfection," she said softly. Her thumb moved slightly, almost absent-mindedly brushing against my knuckles. "Everyone says things they regret sometimes." I looked at her, surprised by the calmness in her voice. "What matters," she continued, "is whether someone is willing to look at themselves afterward." The tension that had been sitting in my chest for days eased just a little. Her hand gave mine a small squeeze before she let it rest there. It wasn't full forgiveness yet. But it was something just as important. It was the first sign that the distance between us might finally be closing. After that conversation in the park, things didn't magically return to normal. Trust rarely works that way. But something had shifted between us. The sharp tension that had been sitting quietly in the background was gone, replaced by a softer, more careful understanding. We both seemed more aware of the space between our words and our intentions. And slowly, life began to settle back into the small routines that had always connected us. A week later, Lena invited me over for dinner. When I stepped into her apartment that evening, the familiar warmth greeted me immediately. The soft yellow light from the kitchen spilled into the hallway, and the smell of garlic and herbs drifted through the air. It felt strangely comforting, like stepping back into a place I had been afraid I might lose. Lena stood at the stove, stirring something slowly in a pan. Her dark hair was tied back loosely again, and she wore a simple sweater with the sleeves pushed slightly up her arms. When she noticed me standing in the doorway, she glanced over her shoulder and smiled. "Good," she said. "You're just in time to help." Her tone was light, almost playful. For the first time since the argument, I felt the tightness in my chest ease completely. I walked over and leaned against the counter while she handed me a cutting board and a knife. "Tomatoes," she instructed, sliding them toward me. "Yes, chef," I replied. She laughed softly, shaking her head. The sound filled the kitchen in a way that felt familiar and reassuring. For the next half hour, we moved around the kitchen together in a comfortable rhythm. The quiet clatter of dishes, the sizzle of food in the pan, the occasional teasing comment, it all felt easy again. At one point, as she reached past me to grab a spice jar from the shelf, her shoulder brushed lightly against mine. Neither of us pulled away. Instead, she stayed there for a second longer than necessary, her arm lightly resting against mine while she searched for the jar. It was such a small thing, but it carried a quiet meaning. Later, we sat together on the couch with our plates balanced on the coffee table. The soft glow of a lamp filled the room, and a quiet movie played in the background that neither of us was really paying attention to. Halfway through the film, Lena shifted slightly, pulling her legs up onto the couch beside her. Our shoulders touched. Again, neither of us moved away. I could feel the warmth of her arm through the fabric of my shirt. It wasn't dramatic or intense, just a steady, comfortable closeness that reminded me how natural it had always felt to be near her. "You know," she said quietly after a while, glancing toward me, "you've been very careful with your words lately." I smiled faintly. "I figured that might be a good idea." Her eyes softened. "I appreciate it," she said. For a moment we simply looked at each other. Then she reached over and gently brushed a small strand of hair away from my forehead, her fingers lingering there for just a second before pulling back. The gesture was simple, almost instinctive. But it carried something deeper with it. It wasn't just forgiveness. It was trust beginning to grow again, slowly, patiently, in the quiet spaces between everyday moments. By the time a few more weeks had passed, the tension from that argument had faded into something quieter, something that felt less like a scar and more like a lesson we had both absorbed. That night, Lena and I sat on her small balcony after dinner. The city was calm in the late evening. Lights from nearby buildings glowed softly against the dark sky, and the faint hum of distant traffic blended with the occasional rustle of wind moving through the trees below. A small speaker sat on the table between us, playing soft music at a low volume. Nothing dramatic, just gentle background melodies that made the night feel slower, more thoughtful. Lena had pulled a light blanket over her shoulders, though the air wasn't particularly cold. She leaned back in the chair with one leg crossed over the other, her gaze drifting toward the scattered lights across the city. I sat beside her, resting my forearms on the railing as I looked out over the same view. For a while, neither of us said anything. But this silence felt comfortable. Peaceful. Eventually Lena spoke. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "arguments reveal interesting things about people." I glanced at her with a small smile. "That sounds like the beginning of a lecture." She chuckled softly. "Not a lecture," she said. "Just an observation." She turned her head slightly toward me. "Most people think conflict is what breaks relationships," she continued. "But usually it's what people do after the conflict that matters more." I considered her words for a moment. "So, did we pass the test?" I asked lightly. Her lips curved into a small, amused smile. "I think we learned something," she said. The music shifted quietly in the background as the wind brushed through the balcony again. Lena reached over to adjust the blanket around her shoulders, and as she did, her hand brushed against mine resting on the table. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, she let her fingers settle over mine. The contact was gentle, almost tentative, but warm. I looked down briefly at our hands before glancing back up at her. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers slowly intertwined with mine, as if the gesture had simply happened without either of us planning it. Her hand was warm against mine. Comforting. She looked out toward the city again as she spoke, her voice quieter now. "Honesty matters to me more than almost anything," she said. "Not perfection. Not saying the right thing every time." Her thumb traced a slow, thoughtful circle against the back of my hand. "But honesty." I nodded slightly. "I'm trying to get better at that," I admitted. She glanced at me again, studying my expression for a moment before her features softened. "I know," she said gently. For a little while, we simply sat there together, our hands still linked between us while the quiet music played. Eventually Lena leaned back in her chair again. Without saying anything, she rested her head lightly against my shoulder. The movement was natural, unforced, like something she had done many times before, even though this moment somehow felt different. More intentional. I could feel the slow rhythm of her breathing as she relaxed beside me. And as we sat there looking out over the city lights, I realized something that hadn't fully formed in my mind until that moment. The argument hadn't just tested our connection. It had deepened it. Because now, beneath the quiet closeness between us, there was something stronger than comfort. There was understanding. Morning arrived slowly through Lena's apartment. Soft sunlight slipped through the curtains, filling the living room with a warm golden glow. The city outside was just beginning to wake up, distant traffic humming faintly, a few early birds calling from the trees lining the street below. I was already awake, sitting at the small kitchen table with a mug of coffee warming my hands. The night before had stretched longer than either of us planned. After sitting on the balcony together, we had moved back inside, continuing to talk about small things, work, childhood memories, the strange ways people grow into themselves over time. Nothing dramatic. Just the kind of honest, quiet conversations that make time disappear. A few minutes later, Lena walked into the kitchen. Her hair was still slightly messy from sleep, and she wore an oversized sweater that hung loosely over one shoulder. There was something relaxed about her this morning, something lighter than it had been in the past few weeks. When she noticed me at the table, she smiled softly. "You're up early," she said, reaching for a mug in the cabinet. "I couldn't sleep," I replied with a small shrug. She poured herself some coffee and sat down across from me, curling her fingers around the warm mug as she studied my face. For a moment, neither of us spoke. But this silence felt different from the one we had shared after the argument weeks earlier. That silence had been heavy. This one felt peaceful. Eventually Lena exhaled quietly and leaned back slightly in her chair. You know, she said thoughtfully, most relationships don't survive their first real conflict. I raised an eyebrow. That sounds optimistic. She laughed softly. I'm serious, she continued. It's easy to be close when everything is easy. When nothing challenges you. Her gaze met mine again. But the real question is whether people are willing to grow after they hurt each other. Her words were calm, but they carried weight. I looked down at my coffee for a moment before speaking. I hate that I hurt you, I said quietly. Lena shook her head gently. You didn't break anything, she replied. Her voice was warm, steady. You reminded me that people are imperfect. She paused for a moment, her expression softening slightly. And then you reminded me that some people are willing to take responsibility for that. The warmth in her words settled into my chest. Before I could respond, Lena stood up from the table and walked around to my side of the room. For a moment she simply stood there, looking down at me with a thoughtful expression. Then she wrapped her arms around my shoulders in a quiet hug. The gesture was gentle but firm, the kind of embrace that carries reassurance without needing words. I stood up instinctively, returning the hug as she rested her cheek lightly against my shoulder. For a few seconds we simply stayed like that. I could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing, the warmth of her presence, the quiet comfort of knowing the tension that once stood between us had finally disappeared. When she pulled back slightly, her hands remained resting lightly on my arms. Her eyes held that familiar calm again. We're okay, she said softly. I nodded, feeling a small smile form. Yeah, I replied. Outside, the sunlight continued to brighten the room, casting soft light across the kitchen floor. The argument that once felt like it might change everything had become something else entirely. Not a breaking point. A turning point. Because sometimes the strongest connections aren't built on never making mistakes. They're built on learning how to face them, together. Expand Keynote 2, 500 Words, Part 2, Silence after the storm. The next morning felt strange in a way I couldn't quite explain. Nothing dramatic had happened after the argument the night before. Lena hadn't slammed a door or raised her voice. She had simply gone quiet, said she was tired, and headed to bed. But somehow that quiet stayed with me. When I woke up, the memory of my words returned instantly, the careless comment, the way the kitchen had fallen silent afterward, the look in her eyes. I told myself I was overthinking it. People say things during arguments all the time. That's what arguments are, messy, emotional, imperfect. Still, the uneasy feeling refused to leave. Later that afternoon, we met at the small cafe where we usually grabbed coffee together after work. It was a cozy place on the corner of a busy street, the kind of cafe where the smell of roasted beans and fresh pastries filled the air the moment you walked inside. Normally, when Lena and I met there, the conversation started immediately. We'd tease each other about something small, share a story from our day, or laugh about something random we had seen on the way over. But that afternoon was different. When I walked in, she was already sitting at her usual table near the window. She looked up and gave me a polite smile. Not cold. Just careful. I sat down across from her, setting my phone and keys on the table. Hey, I said. Hey, she replied. Her voice was calm, but softer than usual. A barista placed 2 cups of coffee on the table, and Lena wrapped both hands around hers almost immediately, as if the warmth of the mug gave her something steady to hold on to. I tried to start a conversation. So, busy day. She nodded slightly. Pretty normal. Then she took a small sip of her coffee and looked out the window for a moment. The silence that followed stretched longer than it normally would have between us. It wasn't hostile. But it wasn't comfortable either. Usually, Lena had this warm way of connecting with people, holding eye contact, leaning forward when she listened, resting her hand casually near yours on the table. Now she seemed more reserved. Not distant exactly. Just guarded. At one point, as we both reached for the sugar jar in the middle of the table, our hands brushed lightly. Normally she might have laughed or made some small comment. Instead, she quietly pulled her hand back and let me take it first. It was a tiny moment. But I noticed. And suddenly the weight of what I had said the night before felt heavier than it had in the moment. We talked about a few ordinary things: work, a movie she had watched recently, a project I was finishing. But the conversation stayed on the surface. Careful. Measured. After about 20 minutes, Lena checked the time on her phone. "I should probably head out soon," she said gently. "So soon?" I asked before I could stop myself. She gave a small apologetic smile. "Long day tomorrow." I nodded, though something inside me told me that wasn't the whole reason. As we stood up from the table, the late afternoon sunlight streamed through the cafe window, casting warm light across the floor. For a brief second, we stood facing each other near the door. Normally we might have hugged goodbye. That had always been natural between us. But this time Lena simply gave a small wave and stepped outside. I watched her walk down the sidewalk for a moment before turning away. And that's when it really hit me. The distance between us wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet. And somehow, that made it feel even bigger.